All right, everybody. The 2026 primary elections for Texas is coming up on March the 3rd, with early voting starting February the 17th. On the ballot are many statewide seats, including governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general, land commissioner, agricultural commissioner, comptroller, and more. Republicans and Democrats also choosing candidates for congressional and legislative offices, the state board of education, and judicial seats. Today, we are talking with Christi Craddick, who is running for the GOP nomination for Comptroller of Public Accounts. Let's go ahead and bring in Miss Craddick. How are you doing today, Miss Craddick?
I'm well. Thanks for having me.
Of course, of course. So we're going to go ahead and just start off here. Why are you running?
Look, the comptroller, a lot of people don't know what it does, so I think I'll start with that. It is the CFO of the state. It does all of the financial decisions, both dollars in and dollars out. And so my goal is to treat those taxpayer dollars, because they are your dollars and mine, with the same care that families use at home at their kitchen tables. And look for fraud, waste, and abuse while I'm there, and make this agency more customer friendly. Look, I'm a railroad commissioner right now, which is the oil and gas regulatory agency of the state. I've been regulating about a third of the state's economy. I've run 3 times statewide, so I appreciate people electing me 3 times. And I think it's important to have some background about how to run an agency. I've also been regulating a state's economy and know how to run an agency with 1,000+ people. And I think making sure and looking for that fraud, waste, and abuse and being more transparent and more efficient has been one of the priorities that I've had at the current agency I'm at.
Well, let's start off here by diving a little bit into your background. You've served as Railroad Commissioner since 2012, and the agency has quite the misleading name. So for those unfamiliar, what is the Railroad Commission responsible for, and what are the responsibilities of a member of the commissioner?
So thanks for that question, because you're right. We like our funny name, though. The Railroad Commission is the oil and gas regulatory body for the state. So what does that mean? It means if you're going to drill a well in the state, you have to come to the Railroad Commission. We have about 200,000 active wells in the state. We also do pipelines and pipeline safety. So we have 430,000 miles of pipe in this state, interstate and intrastate. We do the safety inspections for that, so that's enough pipe to go to the moon and back. If you have a gas utility at your house or in your business, we do the rates for gas utilities. We do training for propane. We also do geothermal. This isn't new. We've just updated rules recently. And we also do carbon and carbon capture issues, which we started doing that really 25 years ago. So if it has to do with the oil and gas industry, we are a part of that, and we have field offices all over the state, one over in Henderson right now, and so historically in Kilgore. So East Texas is original oil and gas. And so oil and gas is important. It is a big piece of the state's economy as well. Last year it brought in $27 billion with a B dollars in tax dollars. And so knowing how to make sure that we have consistent rules and regulations so people continue to want to drill and do business in Texas has been one of the priorities for the state.
Well, let's talk about your record as commissioner. In your own words, what has been your record?
When I got to this agency in 2012, meaning the Railroad Commission, we needed to do a bunch of IT upgrades. So we were on a mainframe Fortran. If you don't know what that is, it's really old IT. We are almost finished and have gone to cloud, which has made us more efficient and more transparent. That's one of the big priorities we've had. We've made sure that we continue to have best practices with our rules, and make sure Washington, D.C. and EPA have stayed out of the Railroad Commission business and allowed us to continue to regulate well. I think we do a better job than any federal government ever does. So those have been some real priorities for us. We've also plugged a lot of wells, and we're continuing to prioritize well plugging in this state. These are orphaned, abandoned wells that we have on our books that we go in and plug to make sure we protect the environment as well. So those have been some of the really good priorities, that and making sure we've got, again, fair, consistent regulations, and finding and keeping good people have been really important for that transparency and efficiency as well.
Well, you served on the commission during a time of growth for the state's fossil fuel industry. We account for the largest share of America's oil and natural gas, production. What has been behind this growth?
I think really our rules and regulations, having fair, consistent rules and regulations has made a big difference. Compare us to Louisiana or New Mexico, for instance. We've got a lot more production, but people know what the rules are. We get permits out timely. So one of the improvements we've seen when I first got to the commission, it was taking us 90 days to get a drilling permit out the door. Now can get a drilling permit out the door in 48 hours. That means businesses are able to go ahead and know what their drilling program is going to be and use their dollars more wisely. And so that's just one example, I think, of where we've improved as an agency. I think we've done a lot of things too and made sure people, again, know what we do, know how important this industry is. And we work with industry as well as landowners to make sure people understand oil and gas, that the rules are being applied consistently. And those are some things I think need to be done at the comptroller's office, working with taxpayers, upgrading our IT over there so we're more transparent and more efficient, and making sure that we're more customer friendly at the comptroller's office. Look, it's your tax dollars at work, and we want to make sure you know where they're being spent. But if you've paid taxes in, say sales tax, for instance, and you're in an audit, one of the things we've gotten some feedback on, it's taking sometimes comptroller's office quite a while to get audits done. Like, it's your dollar sitting there. Well, I think they should be done timely and not take 3 to 5 years. That's worse than the IRS. So those are some things I think that I bring from one agency to another, understanding how we go in, audit an agency, make sure it's working well, we've got the right people, and then make sure that we're working for the people of Texas.
Well, on your page, on the Railroad Commission's website, it says that you have fought against Washington's one-size-fits-all environmental policies that would kill jobs and stifle energy production growth. What regulations have you been opposed to?
So I'm going to give examples because I've been at the Railroad Commission long enough to have gone through Obama, Trump, Biden, Trump. So if that kind of gives you an idea. So during the Obama administration, that administration proposed over 100 rules and regulations that would have regulated oil and gas, coal, other things that we already regulate. I forgot to say we do coal mines, by the way, but other things we already regulate at the Railroad Commission, which would have been another set of regulations. And when the first Trump administration came in the door, all of those went away and we were down to 4 rules and regulations that we were paying attention to federally, because the Trump administration understood that states can do it better. One size doesn't fit all. Biden administration came in, we had the same issues, and even more so, I think even more challenges. And so this Trump administration has come back in, Trump 2, and we are seeing a lot of more opportunity to work with the federal government. A good example for us as an agency just this year, I mentioned carbon capture. Look, whether you believe in carbon capture or not, doesn't matter. We use it in the oil fields and use it as a gas to get more oil out, and it's an important product for the state. The EPA has been in charge of injection wells for CO2 to capture that. We went and asked under the Biden administration, we asked for primacy, meaning we would be in charge of regulating that, not the EPA. We had an application that sat in the Texas EPA, the regional EPA, for about 3 years. They would never send it up to DC. It sat. We realized when we realized that the Trump administration was coming back in, we pulled our application, we redid it, and we resubmitted it last February, so about a year ago. We received primacy from the EPA in October of last year. That's how fast they chose to move and realized that we had good rules and regulations. Look, instead of waiting 3 years to get a permit out, we think we'll do them in 6 months. That's a huge difference in the cost of doing business in this state.
Well, how do you respond to critics who say environmental regulations are necessary to fight climate change?
Look, I think climate change, in my opinion, is a hoax. However, that being said, as an agency, one of our goals is to make sure that we are protecting the environment. To that end, since I've been there, flaring's been an issue, and we have worked with industry and and are regulating even better, I believe. And now the amount of flaring going on in the state in the last several years is down 75%. That's a huge number. And again, it's industry in partnership with a regulatory agency doing that, because if you're flaring money. That's what I always say. I grew up in West Texas, and you're burning natural gas, you're burning money. So it's we've been able also in this state, one of the things Texas has done well is make sure pipelines get built timely. So we don't do routing in this state, but we do make sure that we do look at the routes, we do safety. You can get a permit built in Texas, and a pipeline built in Texas, and 18 months to max at 2 years. In a federal permit, you go through FERC, and some people have been waiting 4 to 5 to even get through the permitting process. So we see an opportunity to make sure that oil and gas, one, protects the environment. That's our job. That's why we have inspectors all over this state. But we want to make sure that we aren't impeding opportunity for this industry to continue to develop appropriately.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about critics and specifically the criticism that you have faced during your tenure. A 2023 article in the Texas Monthly noted how you and your family have profited from oil and gas rights and industry, and the RRC oversees and regulates. Your Democratic opponent in 2022 said, quote here, one of the roles of a public servant is to ensure public confidence in our institutions and our government. They are failing at this. How do you respond to this criticism?
I think it's an interesting comment. I grew up in West Texas, which is in Midland, which is oil and gas. And so, yes, my family's been in the business. We're proud to have been in the business. We believe in public service. And I would say the reason I have all these interests is I believe in reporting them to the Ethics Commission. And you've never seen me have a conflict when I've taken a vote. Everybody gets heard fairly at my agency, and so I think being in the oil and gas industry has been a real positive at the Railroad Commission. I understand it. I know the people on all sides of it, landowners as well as operators, as well as the pipeline companies, and so I'm able to have relationships and work an issue with all sides. So I think that's been a real positive to be at the Railroad Commission and regulate oil and gas based on my family background.
Very well, moving on. Let's get right into the issues listed on your website. You call for a statewide audit and the establishment of a local government efficiency task force that would review the local budgets to root out potential waste. Tell me a little bit more about this.
So to me, when you walk in and you're becoming the new boss of an agency, you ought to audit the agency itself. Make sure that you've found whatever fraud, waste, abuse that you've got going on internally first and foremost, making sure you've got the right people in the right places. And what do you need to run more efficiently and be more transparent? So that's day one. The other pieces that I think are really going to be important I'll be walking in, and it'll be a legislative session. You've got to give good numbers to the legislature so they know how much money they're going to have to spend and where those dollars are coming from. So I think being a fair budgeter and making sure you certify a state budget with appropriate numbers is important. And then you talked about local government efficiencies task force. That's something that we used to do several years ago and that we haven't done in the last several. I think it's a tool the comptroller should be using. When we put state dollars into, say, your schools, we haven't been effectively, I don't believe, auditing where those dollars go. So one of the tools we can use at the comptroller's office is going in before, say, you're going to vote on a bond election for your school board. We can come in and audit your school district, see where the dollars have been used before you take that bond vote. And then you, the local taxpayer, knows where your dollars are being spent, how they're being spent. And then you can choose whether you want to vote for that bond or not. It's more transparency and shows a way to work with state government, with local governments, another opportunity for all of us to know where our dollars are being spent across the state.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about efficiency here. You say you will upgrade the outdated technology. Can you provide some examples of outdated technology that's still in use?
Sure, one of the things that they're slow to use, if you're paying sales tax, for instance, today sometimes you're maybe filing it online, but you're not getting answers online. You're not getting your refunds timely online as well. I think those are some things that can be done relatively easily and are can be used. And by the way, if you don't want to do it online or you need some help, somebody ought to answer the phone. I think that's a real big thing. The other thing we're seeing is that from state agency to state agency has to do with payroll. So at the Railroad Commission, all of my payroll obviously runs through the comptroller's office one way or the other. And we have one system that we do our payroll through, and as do a few other agencies, and then there are other agencies who are using an older system, so we're not all on one system. Well, that's more work for anybody in a comptroller's office. You've got to work on two different systems, match them up, make sure those payrolls match. Those are just two examples that I think are relatively easy to solve that we could be doing and be more efficient.
So, both of those examples, Ms. Craddick, just talking a little bit more about reducing that time it takes for businesses to get those tax refunds, would both of those examples kind of work hand in hand there?
I think so. Look, one of the things that everybody pays if you're a business is sales tax, right? And so we at the comptroller's office can audit you, and you can ask for an audit too if you think you've overpaid, but it works both ways. If we're auditing you, no matter who asks or who looks for the audit to be done, if we're auditing you, it ought to be timely. So some of them are, but some of them haven't been. And I think part of that's training. We need to make sure we're training our people efficiently and effectively and all are on the same page, because you don't want two different auditors come in and have one with one response at one restaurant and you own another one down the street and they have a different response. So we want to make sure that those auditors are being trained. And then if you're due a tax refund, you ought to have it timely. Like I said, I've gotten some feedback from people that sometimes it's taking 3 to 5 years to get an audit done. Again, ridiculous and more longer than the IRS most of the time if you've ever been audited by the IRS. So the goal is to be timely with those dollars. Look, if you're due a refund and the state's holding your money, you can't hire somebody or can't reinvest in your business. And that's not how government ought to work.
Well, let's talk a little bit about how government should work. You say that you will work with state legislators to ensure a conservative budget and spending limits. In your view, what would a conservative budget look like?
Well, I think one, you've got to look at what the numbers are and not overspend ever. At the Railroad Commission, we are a fee-based agency, meaning the oil and gas industry pays for this agency to work. And we've had some challenges. You know, when the price of oil goes down, there are fewer drilling permits that go out. So we've had to deal with ups and downs as an agency. We've been off as much as 30%, but you've still got to do your job and prioritize your spending. Well, I think we ought to do that with it's your tax dollars. We shouldn't just go collect more tax dollars. We should make sure where your tax dollars are being used. Again, that's more transparency. With that transparency, you can be more efficient with your dollars and tell the legislature, look, you've got X dollars, whatever that is, that we see that oil and gas is going to be down, oil and gas is going to be up, that we are going to see some real opportunity with sales tax. We've got a high growth state, so are there other priorities and policy issues they want to improve upon or change? That's their right. You want to make sure that they have the correct numbers and that you give them good information, because it's their job to make those policy. It's your job as the comptroller to carry out the policy.
Well, Governor Abbott put a tax reform at the center of his reelection campaign. If he wins reelection, how will you work with him to slash taxes?
Look, both he and the lieutenant governor have property tax reform on the table. I think that's great for the state. Look, I live in Travis County. Nobody's thrilled about paying property taxes in ours. They've tried to hike them up again this past year. So I'm happy to politically and as a conservative, I'm happy to figure out how we do something different or better with property taxes. That being said, the comptroller's job really is to give good numbers so the policy decisions are decided at the legislature in the next session.
Well, let's move this on over to East Texas. Let's talk about some other issues here. We're a growing region here in East Texas, and according to population estimates from the Census Bureau, Smith County has grown by around 16,000 people, and this is just since 2020. Van Zandt County, 6,000, Henderson, 5,000. In your view, how will your work as comptroller help support this growth?
Look, I think making sure that people know where their tax dollars are being spent is important. So more transparency is really important. In a high growth state, you want your dollars to be spent effectively, and you want to make sure that people know where they're being spent, so being more transparent. But also, if you've got an issue with your local community, one of the things, say you've got a business that is moving in and they want a tax rebate to move in their business. One of the things the comptroller can do, and one of the assets that they have, is to tell your local community, if you decide to give a tax rebate on something and give a tax incentive for a business coming in, what that would cost your community. That's a role that we have at the comptroller's office to help the local communities understand how that would affect them. I don't think that's being used very often. I think that's important. But this state, I'm glad to see that. Look, I'm a rural girl at heart. It's where I grew up, and we're seeing both West and East Texas grow. And I'm glad to see the growth of this state. But we want to make sure our dollars are being used effectively. We don't want to tax ourselves out and become California.
Of course. Well, is there anything else that's not listed on your website that you would like to discuss here in this interview today?
No, I think those are the priorities. Look, we've got voting coming up. Early vote starts on February 17th, and primary is March 3rd. And if anybody's got any questions, please let us know. Christi Craddick for comptroller.com, and go look at our website. So we appreciate the support out there.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us here on East Texas Now. This was Christi Craddick running for the GOP nomination for Comptroller of Public Accounts. And primary elections coming up on March the 3rd, early voting on February the 17th. Christi, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.